Magic is found in every room, where people connect over a shared purpose. Luke, Hannah and Chris explore the role of purpose, courage, mindset and culture in every leader's quest for transformational performance.
Hello and welcome to Magic in the Room. I'm Luke Freeman.
And I am Hannah Broderud. And today we are recording live on location in Big Sky, Montana.
Live on location, just like your nightly news. Yeah, it's super fun because, we get to do this together every month. We've got several clients here, and I love being here once a month. And the work that we're doing is really fun. And it's fun to record this episode too, because it's so directly tied into what we did today, which is kind of fun. I mean, we kicked off this morning with one client doing a leadership development program. Yep. And so it's a multi-month, goes different topic every month, and then they have homework.
Well, we're working through our previous season on the podcast, right? Self-leadership. Lead yourself. What does it mean to be an intentional leader? And that's what we did this morning.
Yeah, and so today's was around personal purpose, and that was fun to work with these leaders. And I was really encouraged by how into it they were.
Yeah.
Because you never know. You never know if people are going to buy what you're selling. I mean, we believe, we're doing this because we believe in the science around if we're clear about our personal purpose, then we can be more effective and more aligned at all sorts of things that we do, right? Personal life and professional life. But you never know. Like, you get the cynics who are like, well, I show up and I do my time and I get paid, and like, that's all I want out of a job.
Sure.
But this room this morning was really cool, like to hear them share about their defining moments and their strengths and put it all together. And next month they're going to come back with a poster of each of them is going to have a poster of their personal purpose and maybe some imagery that represents it. And I'm excited for that. And then this afternoon,
different client, different location. And it's really cool because we get to work within this week, all the different departments. And they are working on making commitments. So we did a whole episode on commitments earlier in this season. We talked about why commitments are important for accountability and why commitments are really lays the groundwork for all of this performance development that we've been talking about in the last few episodes. Yeah. Because it's about getting clear on who we are, what our purpose is, our shared purpose. Sometimes it's called the brand purpose because we really think about brand as identity, right? A brand is not a logo. A logo can be a visual representation of a brand, but a brand is really about who we are and what we stand for, what we believe, right? And so when we can clearly define that, and this client has done a lot of work around defining that, but what's not clear yet is what are the commitments that each team and team member within the organization is going to make? What commitments, behavioral commitments, right? So what are the actions that we say are the boundaries for how we behave, right? How we behave and how we not behave. So what do we do? What do we not do? What are we committing to as part of like our values and who we want to be, what we stand for?
Yeah. So this season, we're really diving into leading a team. And if you've been following along, we've talked about that transition from being an individual contributor to having leadership over other people. We've talked about building trust. We've talked about these commitments that Hannah's shared about, navigating conflict, performance development. And today we're going to talk about corrective action. But it's really interesting because these workshops that we were doing this afternoon are really like foundational. Like if we say, oh, well, we have a core value of integrity, but we don't actually spell out because of that, we have these commitments.
Mm-hmm.
It's very difficult to have fair, consistent corrective action, on the negative side. On the positive side, recognition, right? What do we recognize that's integrity?
Yeah.
We really have to spell out the behavior. So really fun to lay that groundwork with this team today. And our next steps with them are going to be, after we work with every department on their commitments, like, okay, HR team, like, how are we changing orientation? How are we adjusting performance management and documentation and training that we're providing supervisors and managers, so that, everyone's on the same page. Everyone's a part of the same story from their first day on the job, through recognition, through any sort of corrective action, through career development, that we're measuring our performance based on the same commitments.
Yeah. I just want to remind you, if you've been listening for a while, and if you haven't, just want to let you know that there is a free guide to this episode and this season, the different topics that are focused on team leadership, that you can download. So you can kind of follow along, take notes, and you can find that on magicintheroom.com.
Yeah, and I think for this episode in particular, corrective action, it's really easy to get it wrong. And we know a lot of organizations get it wrong. I'm sure listeners know lots of organizations get corrective action wrong. And so having that download to really follow along and say, oh, here's a methodology. Here's what's missing in our equation that I need to kind of go back to the drawing board and fill in the gap, I think could be really helpful for you.
Yeah. And so we'll kind of define corrective action, but it's, clear expectations are really important for any kind of performance management. And we've talked about the importance of development, right? We did a whole episode on performance development and how we think about that holistically. And the kind of analogy or metaphor that we used was of a river, where the river flows, the water is ever flowing. So development is like the river. It is ongoing, right? It's not a one-time event. It keeps moving. And
it's not a annual eval.
It's not a one-time performance reveal.
Yeah, performance reveal.
Yeah. So, and then there's the banks of the river that help to give momentum and direction to that flow. And on the one bank, we have meaningful recognition, which is going to be our topic next month. So we'll do a whole episode on that. Today, we're talking about what's on the other bank, which is corrective action, right? So those are things that help to create boundaries for acceptable behavior. It helps, on the one hand, to really celebrate and recognize when we see that behavior show up, and the things that we recognize and give positive attention to, we're going to see more of, right?
Yeah.
And then there are times when there are boundaries that get crossed into unacceptable behavior or ongoing underperformance or blatant disregard for the values and commitments that we've set. And that's when we have to, kind of head up on this bank of corrective action and take a little detour to get things back on track.
Yeah. So let's talk about how we define corrective action. And so kind of the working definition that we use is that it's corrective action is a progressive discipline policy. So it's steps. And it really is designed to provide a process to address behavior and performance issues that don't meet our standards. So our argument to you today is that corrective action is a part of wider performance management. And we know that many organizations have progressive discipline policy. They have corrective action kind of approach, forms. HR knows how to do it with people who are having performance issues. And, and that's good. That's better than nothing.
Sure.
And we really supercharge our effectiveness at corrective action if we have all these other pieces of performance management built around it Because I'll just say, like, people want fairness.
Mm-hmm.
People need things to be fair. I want things to be fair,
Mm-hmm.
right? But it's a universal human need. And when we tell the same story at the interview, at orientation, at performance development check-ins where we're coaching around behaviors that are strengths and behaviors that can be developed, and we tell the same story that entire time, like it's not a surprise then.
Yeah.
Whenever we go off on that bank and say, hey, we've talked about this bank, we've pointed it out, we've shared about it, we've all told the same story, and now here we are, you made a choice or you made a mistake, now we're here, like that feels more fair. I have more buy-in from the team member if I've done all of those other things versus, hey, you did this thing that, it's against policy. Yeah, I know you haven't read the policy since you signed the handbook when you started 3 years ago, but now I'm going to write you up.
Yeah.
Right. We're battling headwinds when we go into it that way. And do we still have to write people up sometimes? Like, sure. Yes. Right. Well, don't stop doing that if someone breaks policy. And I think there's a more effective, stronger way going forward.
Yeah. And we've talked about the importance of development and how leaders develop leaders. And that is one of our primary roles, is to develop our team members. And, even a corrective action can be, when done well, can be an opportunity for development.
Yeah.
Right. So we talked about progressive discipline. Some organizations have performance improvement plans.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I was part of an organization years ago where, and there's a culture shift that was happening, but at the time, there was a very common phrase that was used, which was, let's coach them out. And that was code for, I want to fire this person, but I know that I have to go through all these steps.
Yeah.
And that's usually the context that the word coaching was used in.
Yep.
Right. And so performance improvement plans were really just seen as, okay, I have to do this so that I can fire this person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think there is a misunderstanding about what is required for a termination in many organizations. And the reality is it really depends on state law.
Sure.
And so if you're listening to this episode about corrective action and what you're really wanting is like, how do I get rid of someone?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you need an employment attorney or whoever general counsel is for your organization to tell you what documentation you need to be able to make that decision.
Yeah.
There are states where there is heavy requirement, and you might have to go through your progressive discipline steps. There are states that are right to fire states, and you don't have to do any of that. And I see organizational leaders pretty often who are trying to go through this corrective action thing to coach someone out, right, to get rid of them. And they're in a state where they can terminate the person today. But I think when we're afraid to hold people accountable, sometimes we look to corrective action as almost a way out of a termination to say, well, I'll give them one more chance. And that's not what good corrective action is for. Good corrective action is for people that we think could have a future with us, and we want to move them through the misalignment into a place where they are aligned and are performing at a high level and to our standards.
Yeah. And when we do this, this is also part of a program that we deliver at some of our partner organizations. And when we do this, we always hear really interesting examples of times when corrective action was done well. Someone was given a performance improvement plan. There was some level of collaboration between the team member and the leader. There was agreement on, what good performance looked like.
Mm-hmm.
And there were some clear steps and milestones for this team member to work through,
Mm-hmm.
some specific areas for improvement. And, we've seen it done poorly, and I'm sure you've probably either experienced it as a team member or as a leader when it doesn't go well.
Mm-hmm.
But when it goes well, and it really helps that it is a little bit of a wake-up call for the team member,
Mm-hmm.
and it helps them turn a corner because all of a sudden they start paying attention in a different way, right? It can be a really helpful tool to actually improve performance, which is the whole point.
Yeah. And I mean, it comes down to clarity is kindness.
Mm-hmm.
And when we provide clarity to people on expectations, like that is an act of kindness, even though it can be unpleasant in the moment. So we're not going to, in this episode, give you the exact word for word, like what needs to be in your progressive discipline policy. A lot of that, it should go back to your values, your commitments, your vision, purpose, right? You should have some sort of language established already that you're saying, this is our standard. Now let's go back and review that. If you need help with that, great, call us. But what we are going to do today is give you a checklist of characteristics for corrective action that you can use as a bit of a litmus test and say, okay, I'm going to pull up our policy, I'm going to pull up our forms and like, does our approach and our policy kind of meet these characteristics? You want to run us through characteristics of effective progressive discipline and corrective action?
Yeah. So first of all, they have to be predictable. So you talked about consistency and fairness, right?
Mm-hmm.
So with that, there's, expectations have to be clear, right? So we need to have clear expectations. What is our standard? And it has to be applied in a consistent and predictable manner that when these boundaries are crossed, there is a consequence. And we understand what that consequence is. So, number one, predictable. Number two, it has to be understood by everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And then we already talked about this a little bit, but three is it's got to be applied fairly.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't give it to some people, but not others.
Yeah.
Right. I sometimes see, you mentioned, the word writing up. Sometimes in certain organizations, I see people get really just like hung up on, they're just writing people up for everything.
Right.
And because they don't have if you don't have a really good skill of providing meaningful feedback and coaching,
mm-hmm. Yeah,
sometimes that's your only tool, right?
Right.
And that's not, fair, because that's what often, you've probably heard those stories. Well, why did I get written up when she didn't? Or why do these people not get written up for the same thing I did, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it has to be applied fairly and then provide clarity.
Yeah. And kind of these first three that you went through, predictable, understood by everyone, and applied fairly, I think those kind of clump together. And I would say like a great strategy for those is like take not knowing off the table.
Yeah.
So how do I as a leader take the idea that I might have a team member that doesn't understand our standards and doesn't understand our progressive discipline or corrective action policy or approach? I got to take that off the table.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's looking at orientation onboarding. Maybe it's looking at continuing education. Maybe it's looking at my meeting cadence to say, am I once a year? I don't know what the right cadence is for you, but am I reviewing this so that not knowing is not an option for my team?
Yeah.
Because it makes it so much easier later, because you can say, well, like, you knew that was against policy or didn't align with our values, right? And like, yeah, I kind of knew that. So like we have to take not knowing off the table.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then it should provide clarity, right? It should not make things more confusing or muddy. It should be clear why this is happening. It should be clear what the goal is with this action, whether it's a, step in a progressive discipline or it's a performance improvement plan. It should be
Mhm.
clear why it's happening. And then it should provide documentation. So that's the fifth one. Like, it is a way for us to document that something has happened and there has been some action.
Yeah.
So we can look back at that for whether it's for legal reasons or historical, context.
And I don't know how to say this nicely. I have a pet peeve because often we are in situations where we are coaching leaders around performance management.
Mm-hmm.
And oftentimes when we come in and do an organizational assessment or a team assessment and we're coaching that leader through change management or a new process or a new product or whatever it is, like there will be people that need corrective action because they're not getting on board. Like it's just a normal daily part of our job that we're changing things up on people and people aren't wanting to follow and their corrective action needs to happen. But oh my gosh, whenever we get to that hard conversation, we're like, all right, well, like you need to go do some corrective action here. Like, let's start progressive discipline. Oh, you don't have a progressive discipline policy. Okay. Well, let's write one real quick. Does everyone agree on this? Yep. Okay, great. Okay, go start this.
Mm-hmm.
And then you check in a couple days later or a week later, and it's like, great. Did you get that written up? And did you send that to HR or put it in the employee file or whatever? Well, no, we didn't really take notes, but we had a conversation. I'm like, okay, well, you got to write it up, and get it in the file. And then you check back a week later. And it's like, did you get that in the file? And it's like, no, I haven't written that up yet. And like, just do it. Like, do that last 10%, and it's going to help you so much down the road. But gosh, it is so common that people go do the really hard part, which is have the conversation, create a policy, create a standard, right? That's all the hard stuff. And then they don't do that last 10% and do the documentation step. So you got to do it.
And the documentation is important. And sometimes for legal reasons, and in, to Luke's point, in some states, there's different expectations for what level of documentation you need to have when you dismiss something. And usually a good HR person stays really up to date on state law, employment law, right? And have a clear understanding of what that is. Montana is one of those states. It's one of the only states in the country that does not have at-will employment. So what that means is it used to be a 180-day window that you could let someone go for whatever reason. Now they've extended that to a year. So within that first year of employment, you can let someone go for basically any reason. But after that, you better have your documentation because it gets very difficult if you don't, right? If you need to let somebody go. So documentation helps for lots of reasons. And that's one of the characteristics of effective corrective action. It should be documented.
Yeah. And I want to take this back to leadership because this season is all about leading a team. And we talked about this kind of cruel trick of the universe where it's like, oh, I'm really good at doing my own stuff. Well, now I have to lead other people. And we haven't been trained on doing all of these things like documentation. But I would just encourage you to think about like your job as a steward of the brand, a steward of the organization, a steward of the purpose of the organization. And that includes risk management. So as a leader, you have risk management responsibilities. And if you skip documentation, you're essentially not doing your risk management responsibility. And so, yeah, we can stop harping on that one. But I think it's an important point to not do the 90% of the hard stuff and then the relatively easy 10%. Like just do it all the way.
Yeah. But I think sometimes that's a symptom because all of these things that we talk about, they take skill. And if you don't have, in your example, if you didn't have this policy in place and you haven't been practicing doing it, you haven't built that muscle. So feels nebulous and hard, right?
Yeah.
So let's make it easy. Let's support our leaders. Let's train them in how to follow the process
Mm-hmm.
and make sure we get some practice doing it in a productive way.
Yeah. Yeah. And ask for help,
Mhm.
right? I mean, it's normal to not know how to do these things. And I remember the last time, okay, maybe I shouldn't say this because then other clients ask us to do it. But like last time I terminated an employee for a client, and sat in with them and like went through the whole conversation. It was like, okay, that conversation's over. We need to, yes, we had a separation agreement ready, but now like we need to document the conversation. We need to send a follow-up email to the terminated employee. And like no one's leaving here until we do that.
Mm-hmm.
And they are awesome. I love working with them. And it's normal that they need that coaching to like, let's close the gap. And yeah, we just did something that was really emotionally difficult. And now we got to sit here and do paperwork. And that's okay. That's just a part of it.
Right. And I do think, like be smart about how you do it too. I had an example of this was a challenging time in my career that led to me choosing to separate from the organization.
Mm-hmm.
There were lots of things that led to that. Some were personal, but a lot of them were around, what was happening in this organization, and the leader that I worked for at the time wasn't a great fit.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that started happening was we worked in the same, I think we worked in the same building, definitely the same campus, and all of our meetings, this leader started doing them online. Even if we were both in the office, it was always a call.
Mm-hmm.
And I could hear the keyboard clicking away in every conversation we were having. Like this leader was a note taker, and they were taking notes on everything I said to the point where it made me really careful about what I said, because they never said that I'm recording this conversation and it wasn't officially recorded, but they were literally writing down everything I said.
Yeah.
And so if you want to create meaningful, honest, open, trusting conversation, we've talked about that in other episodes.
Yeah.
But even like think about how and when you document, right? In a way that is helpful and that also doesn't create an additional barrier between the person you're working with. And then the final characteristic here, just to kind of round out that conversation about characteristics, it should include some kind of path for that employee or team member to take some proactive steps to improve their performance, right? So whether that's an official performance improvement plan or some kind of next step that there's a follow-up around, I think that's like a really important final piece of this, that it doesn't just end with, we document, put it in a file, and then nothing happens after that.
Like I'm going to lob a grenade and write you up on something and then not give you any sort of next step on, are you whole, right? Is the relationship with the organization 100% repaired? Because I would want to know that, right? Am I good? Am I good? And I think I want my team members to not waste any energy on wondering if they're good or not. If they are, right? Like yes, they should focus on improving their performance if there's some clear goals. But if the conversation is all we needed and I'm documenting it and sticking it in their file and, we'll check in, like we should check in again, I guess is what I'm saying. We should check in on that conversation. We should have a plan. Doing the one and done write up is not as effective. I get that sometimes practically we need to, and it's usually better to have a consistent follow-up. And we share with them at the first write-up or first conversation, here's when we're going to do a follow-up, here's what we're going to talk about, and then, we
Yeah.
let them know what's next.
And some organizations even will have the team member sign the record of conversation,
Yeah.
right? And I think that is especially helpful because that's one of those really, it can create a lot of fear when you don't know what's being written about you, what's being documented, what notes are being typed, what is this person really writing up about me?
Yeah.
And sometimes, like one of the worst experiences is when we feel misinterpreted and somebody misconstrues something we did, or let alone somebody tells falsehoods, right?
Yeah.
And you don't feel like you get a chance to clear your name.
Yeah.
So I think it's helpful to be transparent about, we're documenting this conversation. Here's what we're documenting. We all have awareness of this, and as a team member, what the next step is.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. So just to reiterate here, we talked about the litmus test there, requirements for corrective action, progressive discipline. I want to come back and circle around to reiterate, these really should be based on what our commitments are, the behavioral commitments that we've already communicated to people. So leadership is communication, leadership is relationship management, and communicating our behavioral standards, those commitments, is a big part of what we as leaders have to communicate consistently to our team.
Yeah. And things like, so the commitments really help to clarify expectations, right? We talked about the importance of having clear expectations, communicating those expectations clearly. And there are the standards, right? What are the standard conduct or standard accepted behavior? So things like your employee handbook, job descriptions, our company values, our purpose or mission, what are team commitments within in our team, if we've written specific commitments for how we're going to communicate. Those can all be sources of commitments, right? Standards.
Yeah. Yeah. And the same commitments that we use for corrective action should be the commitments that we use in the river of performance development, right? So let's say I have a monthly one-on-one with all of my direct reports, I should be having consistent communication around, hey, let's pull up our 10 commitments that we all have agreed on. How's it going? Like, which of these, here's a couple of these that I think are real strengths of yours. What do you think your strengths are? Here's a couple that I think you could improve. Let's talk about how to improve that. What do you think is something that you could improve? How could you do that? Like, that should just be normal. That should be the conversation. And those exact same things should be what we're measuring against for corrective action.
Yeah. And I especially love when that conversation starts with, which ones of these commitments do you feel like are a strength for you? Let's talk about that, right? And then as a leader, I can add if I have others that I want to add to that, right? To help recognize it. And then likewise, which of these commitments are the hardest for you? Or where do you find yourself struggling? And let's talk about that, right? And then as a leader, here's some things that I see that might be similar or different to what you shared with me. But anytime we do feedback or one-on-one conversations, I always find it really helpful to first ask the team member because first of all, it gives you as a leader a lot of information.
Yeah.
Is there alignment here? Do they see what I see? Do they have awareness of this?
Yeah.
Right? And then you can test that against your own observations. And if there's a huge gap between how they see themselves and how you see them, for better or worse, right? That is cause for more conversation, right?
Yeah.
How can we close that gap and make sure that we're aligned, that I see in you what you see in yourself and vice versa?
Yeah. Great. So let's talk about when to use corrective action. So if you are listening to this, or if you're, have someone that you're like, well, performance isn't great. They're not one of my top team members. I don't know. Do I get out the performance improvement plan, the progressive discipline, or do I not? We wanted to share just a few things that might prompt you to say this is probably the time to move from kind of that day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month performance development, coaching, feedback, and, wins and losses. And it's probably time to move from that and like pull up on the bank of corrective action and build yourself a little campfire there and sit around the fire and have a heart-to-heart. So the first one here is if the expectations are clear. So if you have clearly laid out an expectation and that expectation has not been met, that could be a prompt.
Yeah. And one thing that came up, I sat in on a manager leadership training session with a, client organization yesterday. And, it was brought up that, we often do a lot of training at certain times. So if you are a seasonal business, for example, you have lots of team members starting around the same time. Everybody gets trained in the same expectations. And then you have someone that starts mid-season, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we are a larger organization that tends to hire lots of people at the same time, but then you have someone that didn't come in with the group that got a lot of training,
Mm-hmm.
that may be an instance where maybe the expectations weren't as clear as we thought they were,
Yeah.
right? And so did this team member get the information? Did they get the training? Did they hear it in lots of different ways? Did we test that? Not test in terms of an actual test. Sometimes we do that, right? But do we have some way of knowing that the message has been received and picked up?
Yeah. And that could be for more than just seasonal organizations.
Mm-hmm.
It could be like, hey, so-and-so got hired while our person who normally does orientation and training was on maternity leave.
Mm-hmm.
And oh gosh, we never circled back and did that. So yeah, we got to make sure that expectations are clear. But when they are, and someone doesn't meet them and they knew,
Mm-hmm.
that could prompt you to use corrective action.
Yeah.
The next one is when you've been doing everything else right, basically, and there's still performance issues. So you have a consistent one-on-one scheduled with this person. You have given them feedback about things that are strengths for them and things that could be better. You've talked about this issue a couple times and it is just not getting through and it's not working.
Mm-hmm.
Like might be time to think about corrective action.
Yeah.
And the third use case is similar to that. And it's really around repeated incidents. So when you see a pattern of the same behavior despite previous interventions, right? I'll just say this, what you see and do nothing about is your standard.
Mm-hmm.
So if there is something happening and you're like, well, that's not my standard, that's not our organization's standard, that doesn't align with our values, like, well, it does unless you do something about it.
What you tolerate is your standard.
Yeah.
If you allow it to keep happening, then that's the standard.
Yeah. And I think we oftentimes rationalize ourselves out of admitting a pattern or seeing a pattern. And unfortunately, oftentimes it's like something happens the fourth or fifth time. I would say like, let's be looking for patterns quickly. We're, dealing with one client organization right now, and there's someone who's had some ethical violations, and, it was one of those that we're having the conversation and the team members are like, well, this is hard. We're going to have to do something now, but none of us are really surprised.
Mm.
I'm like, okay, how could we in the future address this sooner?
Mm-hmm.
How could we have acted sooner, really clarified expectations? So yeah, repeated incidents is another trigger.
Yeah. Policy violations. And this is where, and different organizations have different process, but if there is like a progressive discipline, there are certain violations that go immediately to a critical. Some may have to go immediately to dismissal, depending on how serious it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are some policies when it comes to safety or, legal violations that, we're not going through the whole progression on this
Mm-hmm.
one.
Mm-hmm.
When there's either consistent breach of company policy or procedure, or there is a breach that is at a certain level of severity where we
Mm-hmm.
just have to take pretty immediate, dramatic action.
Yeah. Yeah. So the next one is one that probably, I bet the majority of performance or corrective action in the US is probably around this one, and that's around attendance. So here's what I would say about attendance. Like, yes, we should use progressive discipline. I also believe we should use progressive discipline quickly, the minute that a pattern asserts itself. And this is one where some of the things you were sharing earlier, Hannah, around like it's a path for someone to really develop and really have a lot of success, and kind of those turnaround success stories. A lot of those come from attendance corrective actions conversations, because it's an opportunity to uncover like some sort of root cause.
Mm-hmm.
And that root cause could be a transportation issue, a family issue, or it could just be a mindset issue.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, well, I didn't know that starting at 8 really meant being here and being ready at 8. Like, no one's ever told me that before. Like, that happens a lot.
Or maybe I do know that, but I have a hard time staying focused so that I can get myself where I need to go when I need to be there.
Mm-hmm.
There can be, I think there are different personality types that are very, very punctual by nature.
Mm-hmm.
And there are personality types. Sometimes it's personality, sometimes it's experience, it's the family you grew up in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Attitudes towards punctuality. And I think in most Western European society, there are certain expectations around punctuality that are not the same in other cultures.
Yeah.
Right? Punctuality doesn't mean the same thing to all people. And so I think it's helpful to just understand that, get to know our team members,
Mm-hmm.
and understand, is there something deeper, something more concerning? Does this team member need some different kind of support to
Mm-hmm.
help manage their personal lives in such a way that they can, show up on time?
Yeah. And some people, you're not going to solve the issue and they're not going to be able to change. And you're going to end up separating or termination. But for some folks, it's almost a magic bullet, because whatever that root cause thing is, whether it's a mindset or an assumption, or they're just a bit of a mess for whatever reason, whenever you solve it around attendance, it also can unlock and solve kind of that messiness around lots of other pieces of performance, around their level of excellence at other parts of their job. And so there really is a lot of opportunity here to have some of the success stories when it's around attendance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then there's work rule infractions. So when there's we're breaking some kind of rule or standard, and that I think comes back to those commitments that we've talked about, right?
Mm-hmm.
So whether those are explicit rules that we've written out, or they are things that are expectations that are part of our culture, again, we need to make sure, are they clear, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are certain rules for how we behave here, and there are certain rules for how we don't behave. Have we made that clear? And yes, if we have, right, that's always the litmus test. Has the expectation been clearly set? And are we noticing patterns where people are constantly breaking some of these rules or commitments?
Yeah. And then the last one, we don't need to spend a lot of time on, but it's just illegal or other inappropriate behavior. So if it's illegal, right? Yes, corrective action, progressive discipline, termination, and don't wait, right? Don't put it off because you're putting yourself at risk as a leader. So this is kind of our quick rundown on corrective action. And I would just say takeaways is it is not easy. Especially for new leaders, right? Especially when we don't get trained on how to do it, or maybe we're given a policy, but then you've got that big, scary conversation looming. And it's oh gosh, how do I do this? I get that I have the piece of paper to fill out, but that's a small part of the challenge of having this conversation. And there's no easy answer except that you lean in and you do it. Ask for help if you need help. Role play with someone first if you need help with that. Have a third party in the room if that will make you feel more comfortable or safe. Those are all fine things to do. Don't let your ego stop you from getting help in doing corrective action well. It is a skill that is valuable because here's the deal, lots of people really suck at it. Lots of leaders really suck at it. And so if you become someone who this is a competency that you develop, you're able to do corrective action well, especially if it's a part of that larger performance management strategy, and that becomes a core competency of yours, you will always be valuable.
Yeah.
You will have a lot of career options if this is something that you don't shy away from.
Yeah. And if you are a leader of leaders, or you are a seasoned leader who coaches, mentors, supports other leaders, or you work in an HR function where part of your role is to help support leaders in doing these kinds of processes, right? Think about not just support and teach and coach on how to have the conversations, but back to our conversation about documentation and why that often is so hard. I think it's hard because it's nebulous. Do I know exactly what should I document? How should I document it? Where should it be documented? What's the appropriate level of detail? How much do I need to write? Just having those conversations and just setting some clear expectations, create a template, make it easy, right?
Yeah.
Make it easy for people to do this.
And you might have to make it. You might have to improve the way that your company is doing it. And I'd say view that as an opportunity, right? And maybe you don't want to be a corrective action person,
right.
But it is an opportunity to clarify and help everyone else be better. And there's no win there. Yeah. Okay. Fun stuff. I know, but next month will be more fun because it's around meaningful recognition. How do we, as a leader of a team, how do we use the tool of knowing how to do recognition well to increase innovation and performance outcomes of our team? Because there's certainly some tips and tricks on how to do it. Yeah. So as a reminder, the download around corrective action, magicintheroom.com. And you can find us at purposeandperformancegroup.com. We're also on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. And I would just ask, if this is valuable to you, give us a review, star us, whatever it is on the platform you're on. And that helps other people find the show and listen to it. So we would appreciate it. Hannah, we've had a full day.
We have. Yeah.
That's been good.
It's been a good day. So
yeah,
that's it for this episode. Magic in the Room is hosted by Chris Provins, Hannah Broadroot, and Luke Freeman. It is produced by Ben Betts. Social media management is by Emma Holland and Maggie King Robinson. Our theme music is by Evan Grimm. You can find his music on Apple Music. This episode was recorded in Big Sky, Montana. Magic in the Room is a production of Purpose and Performance Group. You can find us at purposeandperformancegroup.com, and you can find previous episodes at magicintheroom.com.